Greg Brown, thank you so much for joining me to kick off our first of our live streamed interviews today from the 4th Annual Kenan Institute Frontiers of Entrepreneurship Conference. During this morning's opening session, we saw the launch of the first ever Trends in Entrepreneurship report, both from the Kenan Institute and the UNC Entrepreneurship Center, which viewers can find in full at frontiers.unc.edu. Tell me a little bit about how this report came to life.
So, as you mentioned, Mackenzie, this is the 4th year that we've done the Frontiers of Entrepreneurship Conference. And as we've included more participants and had more engagement, we've realized that there's a big demand for the conversation to continue beyond just this convening of very interesting and important people in entrepreneurship area, to have that conversation expand to a broader audience and go throughout the year. So what happened was we thought, what's the most effective way to do this, to pull together information from the variety of sources, the variety of types of people that are participating in the conference, and get that out to people. So what we decided to do was create something that's very digestible. So we want to highlight the important trends, the information that's coming out of the specific sessions or the expertise of the researchers that are there, highlight those trends, and then provide a good amount of supporting evidence, but not something that would be like a deep research paper that's hard to digest, but bring it together into something that is very manageable, very visually pleasing, and also available to a broad audience.
Fantastic. What sorts of issues does this inaugural report examine?
So there's about 5 different main themes through the report. These range from what's happening in funding entrepreneurial entities, whether it's startups or broader investment community, what's happening in diversity. We know that there's a lot of issues around diversity broadly in the economy, but especially in entrepreneurial setting, there's even more acute challenges around teams and teamwork, and understanding what is the kind of, maybe some people call it softer side of what drives successful startup activity. And really these themes go through a lot of the different trends that we've identified. Even though sometimes we segment one as funding, it's something that also relates to diversity, for example, when we think about what's happening in the venture capital industry.
Fantastic. Who is the report really built to serve?
So I think it's a broad set of stakeholders or constituents that we're trying to target. Certainly it's the type of people that are here. So it's academic researchers and their students. We hope this is a resource that faculty can use in their classroom with students. Certainly policymakers. I think it's hard sometimes for policymakers to have the bandwidth or the expertise or access to information, so we wanted to provide a resource that would give them high quality, reliable information on a broad set of topics in entrepreneurship. But I think it's also journalists and the media. So obviously there's lots of people out there pushing an agenda, there's lots of fake news, and so we wanted to provide something that was a high quality, reliable set of information that comes from serious academic researchers, that really is vetted in the same way that high quality academic research would be, but for that broader audience, whether it'd be educators broadly, investors, or media and journalists.
That's great, and kind of leads into my next question. We're hearing a lot about entrepreneurship from a lot of different folks these days. It's a huge part of our national political conversation. Why do you think it's important that a university lead this effort and this exploration?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because there's tons of reports that are being generated, by, it could be the investor community or the media or whatever. And I think sometimes it's hard to know if those are reflecting what the current thinking among top researchers is. So the academic community does a lot of research. The downside to that is that a lot of that research is targeted towards other academics. And so it's not something that's readily accessible to the broader community that could act on it. So I think in many ways what we're trying to do with the Trends Report is take that best information, take the cutting edge information, the really rigorous analysis, and then make that available to a broader audience in a way that people have complete confidence in. So let's take out any question as to whether there's a hidden agenda behind a particular piece of reporting that it's circulated, whether these facts are reliable, whether they're biased in some way, whether they're trying to drive someone either for commercial purposes or political purposes. So none of that applies to us. We, as an academic community, are very focused on seeking the truth and trying to communicate that information to people that hopefully are going to be able to utilize it in a way to better policy and better their own investments.
Excellent. Why do you think there is so much about entrepreneurship right now, in the national sphere?
Yeah, I mean, entrepreneurship has sort of exploded upon the scene as something of primary focus over the last 20 years. When I got my PhD 20 years ago, there was no field of entrepreneurship to study. People thought about new firm formation and small businesses, but they did that in the context of strategy or finance. But really, an understanding that there is something fundamentally important about entrepreneurship, and especially its relationship to innovative economic activity. So what the research has shown is that so much of the new innovation happens in startups, right? So as we think about innovation being a drive for productivity, and productivity ultimately being the thing that determines the standard of living in an economy, the thread goes right back to entrepreneurship and what are the things that we should be thinking about as we try to generate entrepreneurial ecosystems that are going to broadly support startup activity.
Excellent. In conducting the research and the analysis for the report, I'm curious what findings aligned with what you expected and what really surprised you?
Yeah, so first of all, the report is really extensive, and I'm a finance and economics professor. I put a lot of my effort into trying to understand and identify the important trends in the finance and economics space. So there were a lot of surprising results to me outside of my own area of expertise. And I think anyone reading the report will force themselves to think about things that they maybe don't think about on a regular basis and expand their own knowledge base. For me as a finance person, I think I was surprised by some of the trends in finance specifically. And I think it's worth thinking about some of these. Maybe the most important trend is this overriding trend about, is entrepreneurship on decline? There's been research over the last few years since the financial crisis suggesting that the number of firms in the economy, the number of companies in the economy is declining. And this is primarily because firms continue to get acquired or go out of business, and the replenishment rate, the new firm formation, is not enough to kind of keep up with that natural attrition that happens in the market for companies. So people were really worried about this. The data was quite stark. It looked like it wasn't just a financial crisis, that the peak had happened sometime around 2005 or 2006, well before the financial crisis, and it was a very significant and pronounced and steady decline all the way up until a few years ago, where things leveled off and started to come back. But still, the most recent data that we have shows that the number of employer firms, that means companies in the United States that have an employee, it's not just a sole proprietorship, that number is still well below where it was in 2005, even though obviously we have more people, we have a bigger economy. So is this a problem? What's going on here? But the real mystery here is that if you look at just sort of the ambient signs of what's happening in the economy, it's booming, right? We have a very low unemployment rate. You look at what's happening, for example, in the venture capital industry. There's never been as much investment in the venture capital industry as there has been the last few years. We have dozens of unicorns, and it's quite amazing what's happened in the venture capital. So how do we reconcile the fact that the total number of firms is declining and people worry about economic dynamism at the same time that we see spectacular successes in sort of venture capital, high growth types of companies? And the answer seems to be we've gotten better at founding companies, right? So it's really the failure rate has gone down. We're starting fewer companies, but those companies are more likely to succeed and more likely to be high growth companies. So this is a major revelation, I think, to be able to tie these facts together, resolve this puzzle. And I think it's great news for the economy overall, because if you think about failed firms, I mean, people just don't know when they start a company whether it's going to succeed or not. There's always uncertainty there. But if we can kind of narrow the odds so that we're betting on companies that have a higher probability of success, that's a sign of economic efficiency. That means we're not wasting resources starting companies that ultimately are not going to be contributors to the economy. So I think this is a very important insight. It's one that various researchers have hit from different angles, and it's really one of the main things that we're pointing to at the beginning of the report to set the stage for why many of the other issues that we talk about are important. I think another really interesting trend, and one that I've spent quite a bit of time researching, is just how capital markets have been changing. I mean, I've already mentioned the venture capital industry being much bigger than it ever has been. So people think of the tech bubble as being this kind of peak in venture capital activity. But if you look at a long-term trend of investment in the venture capital industry, the tech bubble and burst is like barely a blip. It's a tiny thing compared to the amount of investment that's happening now. And what's happened is sort of several important trends. The first one is that we see more dollars being invested into venture capital. We also see it being invested at later stages, right? So there's some concern that the number of public companies in the U.S. has declined, that this could be a bad thing. It's limiting the amount of investment that's available in the economy. But it seems like when you take a holistic view of what's happening in capital markets, that the private capital formation through institutional investors providing capital to venture capital funds and growth capital funds and expansion capital funds, and even up into private equity now, which is starting to, traditionally private equity would invest in sort of mature cash flow rich companies, but now private equity firms are also investing in growth companies more and more. That now we have a more rich and robust set of investment opportunities for new companies. So I think this is a really profound change in capital formation, broadly speaking, but something that speaks specifically to what's happening in high growth industries that venture capital tends to support.
Excellent, that's great.
Yeah.
Now, if anyone watching would like to learn more about the report or get involved in the creation of iteration 2.0, can you tell them how they can do that?
Sure, yeah. So one of our goals is to make this an ongoing project, sort of a living, breathing opportunity to incorporate new information. So when we look at who the contributors to the report are, it's certainly academic researchers, but it's also people that are working at government agencies that collect and process data for the government. It's think tanks that are doing their own research. And so our hope is that we're going to be able to include new trends, new information as these become available, as people are doing the analysis, and contribute those to the report. And we're going to provide quarterly updates to the report, and then roll everything up on an annual basis to a big annual report. So it's very easy to do. We're not asking any kind of heavy lift for people. Take the work that you're already doing. Take the analysis that you've already created as part of whatever work you're doing, and distill it down into just a set of bullet point major trends. Like if you had to give somebody an elevator pitch as to why this was an important topic that other people should be aware of, what is that? Then provide about maybe 3 or 4 or 5 slides that provide supporting evidence for that. So this could be data, it could be interviews, it could be surveys that are done, and provide some context for that. And then finally, if you are an expert or you know an expert, ask them what their opinion is on that, and create just a slide that has the expert opinion of yourself or people in your network, and then submit that to us. You just email it to frontiers@unc.edu. It'll go into our advisory board, into a review process, and assuming that it's something that we think should be shared out, which we hope it is, have every expectation that it would be, it'll be included in subsequent releases of the Trends Report.
Fantastic. Greg, thank you so much for your time. Again, for folks watching at home, you can download the full Trends in Entrepreneurship report for 2020 at frontiers.unc.edu. Greg, thanks again for your time.
My pleasure.
Chris, it is a pleasure to have you with us here at the Frontiers of Entrepreneurship Conference.
Thank you.
I know that you have done substantial research in your role at the JPMorgan Chase Institute into what drives revenue and firm success within communities, with a specific focus on small businesses.
Mm-hmm.
Can you briefly speak to the importance of small business to our economy, and particularly to the role that younger firms play?
Sure, and thank you for asking, and thank you for having me. This is a really great opportunity. I think a lot of people have drawn attention in a lot of ways over the last 20, 30, even 40 years to a lot of the contributions that small businesses make to the economy. It's almost become a taken for granted fact that they're responsible for creating a lot of the jobs, and particularly the young firms, right? Like the research has really shown that essentially all new net job creation is coming from young firms. One of the distinctive things about the JPMorgan Chase Institute's data is that we have data on a wider universe of firms than just those that are sort of creating jobs in their employer firms, which I think is really important because the broader universe of small businesses, it's not just creating jobs, right? Particularly when you think about the majority of small businesses that actually either are micro-employers or don't have any employees at all. They're creating that first order wealth for so many families, the small business owners themselves. They are embedded in the economic communities that they're in, so the customers that are coming through the door are getting sort of a diverse set of products and services. Their suppliers, other than their employees, right? Everybody else that's in the community And when the small businesses are growing and they're thriving, the whole community that they're embedded in is thriving. And it's beyond jobs. The jobs are super important. The innovation is super important. But particularly for that broader universe of small businesses, just so much more than that.
That's great. Our 2020 Trends in Entrepreneurship report, which we released just this morning, notes that though there is a lot of research and press around the role of venture capital, most businesses, and particularly those that are smaller and community-based, really rely on more traditional sources of capital, such as personal savings, bank loans, and support from family and friends. Based on your research, what have you found are some of the challenges that small business owners, especially those of young firms, face when it comes to financing their businesses?
That's a great question, and it's been really revelatory for us in trying to sort of think about what's happening in the sector. The question of access to finance and capital, of course, comes up all the time. Just as a framing point, one of the things we're most surprised and interested to discover was really about firms that we call organic growth firms that grow organically, that don't actually use that much external finance. So think of them as running a business and growing that business. Maybe there's the sort of non-traditional finance, the things coming out of the family or sort of not the venture capital, but also just because they are successful businesses and they're reinvesting their profits and growing the businesses. Those businesses are super important and they're really driving a lot of the aggregate growth that we see. But in terms of the cash flow challenges, the challenge that these businesses are trying to solve with finance, that's the other unique thing that we really get to see in a way that is, in some sense, unprecedented, to have this lens on the de-identified transactions of 1 million businesses. You really see how so many businesses that are growing and that are surviving and creating that contribution to the community are really having a lot of what appear to us anyway to be unpredictable cash flows. You're using finance to try to map between, I have employees that I need to pay today or suppliers that I need to pay today for a product that I'm going to sell tomorrow. And that timing mismatch is more prevalent than I thought, than the team thought, all of us even having quite a bit of exposure to the sector. And so being able to see that specific cash flow management challenge and see the different kinds of cash flow management challenges, say that your more typical business faces as compared to the archetype of the Silicon Valley firm has been really enlightening.
Excellent. Now, beyond just those financial burdens, what are some of the other challenges that small businesses face that affect their long-term survival, and what can be done to mitigate those risks?
That is a really good question. I mean, most of what we see, to be fair, is the financial stuff, right? And so it would be unfair not to sort of observe that there are other non-financial challenges as well, and lots of other researchers speak really well to that. I should be more up to date than this than I am, but the last time that I checked, for years, the NFIB survey, for instance, has been showing that access to qualified employees, sort of a tightening labor markets, thing like that, has been a persistent thing that at least that small businesses are reporting. One thing that we were able to look at that I thought was kind of a pivot in how we think about the healthcare issue anyway. So many of the small businesses that we observe are, like I said, micro-employers or non-employers, and an under-attended to, we thought anyway, feature of the healthcare debate that was really salient, some years ago, and I think continues to be when you ask small business owners, like, what are your challenges? Are the challenges that small business owners themselves face getting health insurance. They're in an individual market often. They don't have employer-supported health insurance because they're small business owners, right? And so if no one in that family works for a large firm that can provide health insurance, sort of all the churn that's happening in that market is really disproportionately affecting like those very small business owners. And it was something that we thought was really important to draw attention to, especially when you look at the growth in those costs for those owners. It's higher than we thought it would be, to say the least, and it's something we think people can pay more attention to.
That's really great. How would you say the socioeconomic conditions of a small business's surrounding community affect its financial performance?
That's also a great question. And one of the remarkable advantages we have with the luxury of having the data that we do, it's like big data, and people like to talk about the data and sort of talk about the size of the sample, which we do too, I do too. But practically, one of the things that means is that we have enough of a number of businesses that we can really drill down, not just to like a city level or a state or a region, but actually down to like a community or neighborhood level, and see some of the differences that have been very hard to see before in terms of the financial outcomes of small businesses. And the kinds of things that we're seeing are that the other socioeconomic conditions in the neighborhood, call it the education level, assets that you might measure through housing value, racial composition, all of the things that I think the broader social science community has focused on as sort of determinants of household well-being. Many of them are really playing into sort of the financial outcomes for small businesses, and we see market differences across those dimensions in terms of revenue and profitability, cash liquidity that the small businesses really need to sort of weather that uncertainty that we regularly see in cash flows is really driven by those kinds of factors.
Interesting. Well, now that we've identified a lot of the challenges that small businesses face, let's pivot to what can be done to help these businesses thrive. Can you outline the stakeholders who have a role to play in supporting small businesses, and particularly those just getting started?
Sure. I mean, in some sense, I think there's the obvious ones that I think anybody would say. There's certainly like local governments, local, federal, state governments, so the whole range. The private sector, of course. Financial service providers, both big and small, are providing products that small businesses are using to manage cash flow challenges. CDFIs, in particular, are providing sort of interesting and innovative combinations of capital and technical support or trusted guidance. Like all of these players, both through policies, regulations, but also through products, have, I think, a role to play in sort of being responsive to at least what we're seeing in terms of those kinds of challenges.
Excellent. What would you say your top policy suggestions would be for local governments to help drive organic growth for their community businesses? And then zooming out, what roles do state and federal government entities play in supporting these smaller and younger firms?
Sure. I think the first thought that at least comes out of the research that we've done so far is that policymakers might be more attentive to the broader universe of small businesses. I think there's a lot of appropriate attention on small businesses that are somewhat less small, that are already using sort of substantial amounts of capital, and sort of like, can we get them more in order to drive innovation and job growth, which again, I think is super important. But there's just so many families that are touched by the broader universe of the organically growing small businesses, the sort of micro employer businesses. And it's not always as clear that across the board that the policy universe is always as considering of those small businesses, and it's just a lot of opportunity to touch more households through that kind of activity. The other thing I think we've observed is that a lot of the activity growth that we see is in industries that are more commonly populated by small businesses. So high tech is an important industry. I have some experience there in my own personal background, and so I have a personal affiliation to it, but there are lots of construction firms, there are lots of professional services firms. There's innovation that's happening there as well. And so to the extent that there's industrial targeting, at least considering whether a larger population of somewhat smaller businesses might be a way to have impact as opposed to focusing on the quite small sort of high-tech entrepreneurship space.
Absolutely, that's helpful. Shifting focus just a bit, consistent with the findings of our Trends in Entrepreneurship report, recent research that you've released from the JPMorgan Chase Institute finds that women who start firms have 34% lower revenues and grow more slowly than those started by men, but they're just as likely to survive. To what do you attribute this slower growth of women-owned firms?
I would love to know the answer to that. This is a really good question. It's a really good question because there's a lot of research that points at different things that might be drivers. And maybe we shouldn't just say research, but there are popular narratives about women-owned businesses that sometimes take the shape of, well, women choose to be in different lines of businesses and they become entrepreneurs for different reasons, all of which may be true. But I think the jump from that possibility slash observation slash speculation to sort of revenue growth being lower, performance being different in certain ways, demands a little bit of investigation. And so as best as we could with the data that we had, we tried to unpack some of that. The thing that we had the cleanest lens on was sort of the industry that small businesses were in, and sort of that question about are women choosing to be in different industries. And so we did control for that, and the effects didn't go away. So at least some of those mechanisms that people have identified as potential drivers, we are less confident that that's actually what's driving the growth of these businesses. And so we think it's worth understanding. If it's not that, then what is it? Because there's to see small businesses that are doing just as well, surviving just as well, managing their cash maybe even a little bit better, but to not see the revenue growth feels like it could be a really big missed opportunity.
Definitely. Would you say there are actions that could be taken to support these women-owned firms that would be different than the recommendations that you might provide more broadly to small businesses?
I mean, I really think, and this is a little bit of a pivot, but the first action would be to try to more precisely pinpoint sort of, well, if not the selection and sort of like, why are you doing entrepreneurship, like what really is the difference, and then sort of to focus resources against that.
That's really helpful. And Chris, one of the questions we're asking folks today is also about the future of entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. We have a couple schools of thought, one that entrepreneurship may be in decline, another that says, hey, if you examine the quality of the entrepreneurial ventures taking off today, it's actually improving over time. Where would you land on that, coming at it from your lens at the JPMorgan Chase Institute?
I'm definitely going to be wildly speculating here, but that's fine. I mean, I have seen the data on sort of the declining rates of sort of founding over time, although that's sort of like had a little bit of a different trend line of late. I just think that it's going to be different. You know, so the JPMorgan Chase Institute has lots of different streams of research. I sort of lead our small business research, but my colleague leads our like our household research. There's a conversation about like how big is it anyway, but about like the growth and sort of the relevance of what we would call the online platform economy, what others call the gig economy. And sometimes I jokingly say to Fiona, my colleague, like, you know, that's really small business research. So even getting like the terms of the conversation right, I think is the sort of thing that I want to do before opining on it, because there's all these new forms of activity that are happening. And is that a small business? Is that thing that's happening within another business? Is that social venture? Like all of those things aren't necessarily being captured by the traditional statistics around small business. So it's a little bit hard to know, but we certainly do see a lot of new kinds of entrepreneurial behavior happening that is at least exciting to see that growing.
Yeah, that's such a good point. We struggled with the same thing in the creation of this report, whether it's the definition of an entrepreneurial ecosystem or kind of how to categorize research about these different ventures. There's a lot of uncertainty there, and I know we're working to hone in on that as well. So would appreciate folks' feedback on how they view a lot of these terms and how they use them in their businesses for future iterations of our report.
Cool.
Excellent. Well, Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you again.
Really appreciate having you here, and I'll let you get back to the conference.
Thanks.
Starr, thank you so much for taking the time to be here and join us from Chicago. I'd love to start off with a broad view. Tell me a bit about your work as well as the role you see for universities to play in supporting entrepreneurship and innovation.
Thank you so much. I like to tell people I think I have the best job that there possibly could be. I work at the Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the University of Chicago. And the work I do is to help launch the next generation of very high impact companies, things that will change people's lives. Every day I get to work with entrepreneurs, with students, with researchers, really thinking about what are the biggest problems that exist in our world today and how could something like entrepreneurship help solve them. It's a joy. It's wonderful to get so much diversity in the work I do and so many interesting people to work with.
That sounds fascinating. Tell me a little bit about how the support universities provide for entrepreneurship and innovation supports regional economies.
Absolutely. The universities play a major role, in my opinion, in supporting the regional economy in something like working in entrepreneurship and innovation. One of the ways that they do that is simply by talent generation. We all know that universities attract brilliant students and brilliant faculty members from all over the world. And we're all together in this petri dish together, thinking about what could we do to really advance innovation and generate new ideas. And so, the first and foremost from the university, you see this great talent pool that can then help create jobs, help create new businesses in particularly the area around the university, but truly around the world.
Perfect. I know that the Polsky Center is home to the Edward L. Kaplan New Venture Challenge, a top-ranked accelerator program. Based on your experience, what impact do accelerator programs have on job creation and economic development?
Accelerator programs can do a lot. There was at one time a proliferation of accelerators, and now I think people have really dialed into what is the role of an accelerator and what can it really do to help young or emerging entrepreneurs get a foot in the door and launch something from concept stage or early stage really into growth stage. So accelerators, in my opinion, some of the biggest advantages they have, one is that they tend to be cohorted. So if you are an entrepreneur in an accelerator, you are in a group of a set of entrepreneurs who are working together side by side. That's a major resource because when you have a problem or you have a question or you need a referral to a lawyer or to a customer you're really trying to get, you have other people around you who are going through the same experience that you are. So first and foremost, I think that's one of the major components. The second is that there's a timeline. So accelerators like the New Venture Challenge that we have don't go on forever and ever. You have a really short amount of time actually to make a huge amount of progress. And that adds some stress because there are deadlines that you have to meet and there are expectations that investors and others might have of you. But it also just raises the bar for all of the founders. And one of the things that I've discovered is that the higher you raise the bar, the higher they rise to the challenge. So if you set expectations really high and they know they have to make progress really quickly, they do astonishing things.
I love that. What are some of the other best practices that university-based accelerators can adopt to be most effective in supporting their student and alumni-led businesses?
Great question. So I think what universities can do really is think about what their unique advantage is. So not every university has the same pool of students, not every university has the same pool of research, and we are located in all different geographies, and the innovation economies in those geographies is different. So if you are in a geography where there's a ton of health technology or a ton of internet technology, or there's some kind of density in something like esports, it could be anything, I would think about what your accelerator can do to really shine a light on that type of innovation and really give you an unfair advantage. If you set a focus around the accelerator, then it draws out the best of the venture capital community who really wants to see what's at the cutting edge in that field, and it really helps you define yourselves and define who you are.
Excellent. I know that the Polsky Center also has an innovation course sponsored by the National Science Foundation, which supports the University of Chicago researchers and students in commercializing their research and ideas. From your experience, how important are government-run programs in supporting entrepreneurship and innovation at U.S. universities?
Government programs are very important. So for our Innovation Core, our I-Core program, we've been running it for 6 years. We've served about 500 or more researchers to date. And it is really important that this program is funded by the National Science Foundation. Part of the reason for that is that the researchers who I work with, the majority of them would be surprised to be called an entrepreneur. They think of themselves in the academic context, and they are working on the generation of new knowledge, not necessarily what is my commercialization plan to get this piece of technology from the lab into the world. An agency like the NSF or NIH or the Department of Energy putting together resources to help these researchers think like entrepreneurs, or really think about how could the work that I'm doing have a direct impact on people's lives, on humanity? What are the products or services based on my research that could really change the world for the better? Because that impetus is coming from the government, and the government agencies, they're all familiar with them through their research, it really helps them understand what is the value of this research I'm doing in the context of impacting humanity, and what are the resources that even I could have to start thinking like an entrepreneur and applying it. But it's generally not something that they know coming in because they've never been trained in that type of applied analysis for their research.
That's really interesting. Turning our attention slightly, what does an entrepreneurial education offer students? And do you think students, even those who aren't interested in becoming entrepreneurs themselves, can benefit from that entrepreneurial training?
I love teaching entrepreneurship to the students. It's still a relatively small number of students who will actually take an entrepreneurship class and then decide I'm going to go launch a new company based on what I've done. So I think there's a lot that students learn simply through the process, whether or not they actually decide to found the company they might work on in a class. For me, what I've seen with my students, the biggest thing that they take away from the experience is confidence. In an entrepreneurship class, you are usually required to make a lot of decisions in profound uncertainty. It's quite challenging. And the problem solving, it never really ends because you're trying to do something new that no one has really done before and with resources that are quite limited. For me, the students I teach are primarily all first-time entrepreneurs, so this is the first time they're doing it. What I see in the classroom is coming in the level of uncertainty, how am I going to do this? Is this something that could really live and be in the world? To where we get at the end of the class where there's a lot of conviction around their idea and their ability to sell their idea to other people, investors, other people who might want to join them. They gain a ton of confidence through that process. And that, I think, can be game-changing no matter what you decide to do in your life.
Never hurts to have a bit of confidence, no matter your career trajectory. That is for certain. I know that you're actively involved in commercialization efforts around some STEM projects. I'm curious as to what new technologies are coming out of the university today that really excite you.
So the University of Chicago has a major healthcare system, a medical center. And so a lot of the STEM technologies that we see really relate to how to improve healthcare for people, whether it's novel therapeutics or healthcare medical devices or healthcare IT. We tend to see quite a lot of that. And we're very fortunate to have some of the world's leading researchers in things like immuno-oncology. We have a faculty member who has so much depth in food allergies, who's working on a therapeutic to actually help kids who might have a milk or peanut allergy that could be quite severe. And so some of the really exciting things that we've been working on lately are in that realm. And they're things that you think, if this therapy existed to help kids with food allergies, what a game changer that would be. These are things that are actually saving people's lives.
Gosh, that's really exciting. As someone with a food allergy, I also am personally invested in that, so that's fantastic to hear. In your view, what can ecosystem partners such as universities and accelerators do to be more inclusive of underrepresented founders?
Underrepresented founders is a major issue in the field of entrepreneurship. It's not only female founders, there are few female founders. A lot of the entrepreneurs pull from technology-heavy fields, which tend to have fewer underrepresented populations. It is a major focus of, I think, almost every entrepreneurship program today to think about how to bring diversity into the entrepreneurial field. One thing that is interesting, if I can brag about Chicago a little bit, is a study was done in 2018 that showed that actually a third of Chicago's founders are female, which is a huge number compared to the population in general in entrepreneurship. And so one of the things we've been thinking about a lot is, why is that? One of the advantages I think that Chicago has is that it does have a pretty dense population of universities. And if we can do more at the university level to highlight our female founders, to help give them tools and resources, find investors who are familiar with female founders, and those founders tend to start businesses that might serve a female demographic. And so if we find the right investors, we can start more of those ventures and help bring more diversity into the field. But it is a major issue, and I think if every entrepreneurship program is not thinking about this, they should be.
Absolutely, and I know we're going to be talking to Arlan Hamilton later today from Backstage Capital. She works very closely with providing funding for underrepresented founders, but it's a top issue and one that we cover in the Trends in Entrepreneurship report as well. My last official question for you is, we may take the conversation from here, but what are some of the best practices you employ that encourage greater inclusion from a wide array of students and alumni?
I think you have to think about things, I know the word pipeline gets used a lot when talking about diversity or making more inclusive environments for entrepreneurs, but I do think you have to think about the steps in the pipeline. So we have been developing, for example, more with younger populations to really understand, how do we create inclusive environments from the very beginning. One of the things that's rather unique to the University of Chicago is that we're located on the south side of the city, and that is a different demographic than if we were located on the north side of the city or downtown. And so we try to engage really fully with the people all around us to think about, what are we doing that's creating barriers, and what could we be doing to create more inclusivity? In general, maybe the lowest hanging fruit is just having this conversation, having conversations about what needs people have and what the university or our unique advantages and resources that we pull from by being at a place like the University of Chicago. What could we be doing to do more in that regard?
That's great. My last question for you is something that has really been a theme of our conference thus far, and I think will continue to be for the next few years, but there's some conflicting opinions about whether entrepreneurship is dying off or whether taking quality into account, it's really growing. Can you speak to that? Working with some of the brightest and best of our future entrepreneurs, what does that landscape look like for you moving forward?
I think it's an interesting observation. I think we have found that the quality of ideas in some of our programs has been improving year over year, but it means that you might not receive as many ideas. I think a lot of people have tools now to evaluate the viability of an idea right from the beginning. And so, I can think of programs we run where I used to get, tons of ideas that some were good, some were less good perhaps. And it was just, students coming to me saying, what do you think about this? Now I think a lot of the students are thinking about it themselves, or the young entrepreneurs who I might be working with in other contexts are saying, let me first understand how to test this idea and see if it has any traction before I do something more formal, either before I launch or before I put it through an accelerator program. One of the things that we teach in programs like the I-Core, the Innovation Core, is customer discovery and how important it is to actually go talk to your potential users or the people that you think you're going to serve before you really finish creating your product. That type of methodology, I think, helps young founders figure out, am I really solving a problem for someone? Or is this an idea I just happen to like but doesn't really have legs as a business?
Perfect. Starr, thank you so much for sharing your insights and,
Thank you.
and for your time.
Thank you very much.
Brad, thank you so much for being here and taking the time to join me. I want to start with a question about the foundings of your firm. When you and Fred Wilson created Union Square Ventures back in 2004, you really set out to invest in the applications layer of the web. Later, you stated a refined investment thesis in a tweet to invest in large networks of engaged users, differentiated by user experience and defensible through network effects. Can you speak about how that thesis has evolved over time and why?
So, sure. Venture capital is, I'll use a biological analogy. When a meteorite hits and it throws everything up into the air and all of the biological niches are gone, and all of a sudden there's repopulation of those niches in different ways. Whenever there's a fundamental change in a technology or regulatory environment or something else, you have these opportunities. And so it's kind of cyclical. And we, in the 2004 timeframe, actually more like 2005, 6, 7, were really early in committing to, networks and network effects and what people called Web 2. And it was a moment when a company like Tumblr with 8 employees could get to 100 million monthly active users, and it's since then sort of evolved. As the market has consolidated, the niches have settled down, and it's not nearly as wide open as it was back in that time. So we have begun thinking about how do we invest around the dominant incumbents, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon. How do we invest in ways that expect their existence? So do we invest in things that help smaller companies compete more effectively with bigger companies? And we've also begun investing in things that we think might be the next turn of the wheel. What opens up, what's the equivalent of another meteorite that opens up the niches again and creates that kind of explosive opportunity that we saw in the 2007 timeframe.
Excellent. How do you see the opportunity for venture capital investment today?
Well, as I said, it's different than it was. I think that one of the things that we talk about in the venture business today is the Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon kill zone. And so I think, I've been in the business for a long time, and in the mid-90s we used to think about the Microsoft kill zone. So you can't fund a company that's going to go into a business that Microsoft already has a presence in or expects to have a presence in. I think, we're kind of, in the same space right now. It's very difficult to compete. A company that has an enormous user base, an enormous amount of data about how those users interact with the service, the ability to distribute through that user base, to promote through that user base, to target specific people. And, users have also made a bunch of choices. They don't have as much time as they did. Back in the 2006-7 timeframe, people were discovering, this web for the first time and figuring out what they wanted to do. Now they've made choices, they've got time commitments, so it's much harder to break through. And so I think, we are in a period of consolidation, and so it means that you have to invest differently, think about the opportunity differently.
That's right. I know that you've been working in the technology market since the early 80s and have been investing as a venture capitalist since the mid-90s. For much of that time, venture capitalists and their portfolio companies have not faced much regulatory scrutiny. But today's tech leaders are being called to testify before Congress, companies are being investigated by the FTC, and presidential candidates are calling for the largest tech companies to be broken up. What's changed?
Well, back in the 80s and 90s, for the most part, technology was apolitical. If you build a slightly faster switch or a better microprocessor or a better storage chip or and any of those things, it didn't really have an impact, at least certainly not directly, on the political conversation. Now we've got politicians who are politicians. We've got social media platforms that are actually influencing the outcome of elections, and politicians care when something's influencing the outcome of an election. And so we've also got a situation where a small number of dominant platforms are beginning to have a pretty significant influence on not just the outcome of elections, but also the way people live their lives. And so I think it's a combination of people becoming less comfortable that they are actually in control of their online presence and in control of the data that they contribute as they interact with these services, and politicians becoming less comfortable that these platforms are actually manageable in some sense. And so you're now hearing a lot of calls to break up these platforms. I personally think that that is, taking a solution that was designed for the industrial economy and trying to apply it to the information economy. And I think it's going to end up it undervalues the value of the platforms in a way. I mean, by today, the integration of a user experience across multiple services, whether it's Instagram and Facebook, actually is kind of helpful to a user. Single sign-on, single login, that sort of thing. Breaking it up it makes the user's life a little bit more difficult. There is an emerging conversation about not breaking up the platforms, but rather breaking up the data. One of the things that is a bit frustrating as somebody who invests in this space is watching the regulatory conversation and all of the well-meaning people who are trying to defend a user's agency and autonomy and privacy, against the consolidation that's happening in this space, is that it feels as if they're suggesting regulatory moves that will actually entrench the current incumbents and stifle innovation, as opposed to attacking the underlying cause of the problem. And I think when you peel back the layers of the onion, you are left realizing that the underlying cause is a lack of control over the data that we contribute to these platforms as we interact with them. And I think there's an emerging conversation about should we be rethinking some notion of a property right in that data? Whose data is it? Is it our data? Is it their data? My partner, Nick Grossman, has a fun way of describing this, which is, Facebook can't create data without a user, and a user can't create data without Facebook. So it's kind of like two people coming together to make a baby. And now we're talking about custody. We don't really know. It's not as easy as saying either one of them actually should own the data. It's a more complicated problem. But that conversation is going to lead to an interesting outcome. I think it will lead to a restructuring of the market that will allow for some of the problems of the current market dominance to sort of take care of themselves. But that's my optimistic point of view.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Well, governments around the world are certainly facing this challenge and doing a deeper dive on this issue of regulation. What do you think is an appropriate action for governments to take? Is there a right way to regulate? Is there a wrong way to regulate? It sounds like some of the mentality is a bit outdated.
Yeah, I think it is. They're catching up, but I think that trying to prescriptively regulate a particular outcome, trying to say that, trying to, construct a body of regulation that would prevent a social media site from actually influencing an election is a whack-a-mole game. It's really difficult for a regulatory body to stay on top of the pace at which that situation is changing. And it also leads to a really potentially dangerous problem. What tends to happen in regulated industries is they ultimately end up, the regulators end up being captured by the industry. And so you can see it a little bit if you think about the telecommunications industry and the FCC. The most recent rulings on net neutrality are really basically designed to further the interests of the telecommunications industry and not any kind of emergent innovation. And so that happens because there's this revolving door between the two, but it also has a more sinister consequence, which is if you look at some of the surveillance, things that were happening that Edward Snowden revealed, it turns out that the government was basically tapping into the pipes and pulling all of the data off the pipes. And nobody knew it. And because if you're a regulated industry, you have an interest in actually helping the government accomplish whatever it wants. And thankfully, we live in a democracy that has some checks and balances. But if you think about the consequence of that in a place like China, it's really not great. And so The question is, can you come up with a regulatory framework that doesn't actually create this captured relationship between the regulators? And I think there is an opportunity to do it, and there's a very early conversation about the difference between protocols and platforms. If you think about the original internet, it was so generative because it was a protocol, and a lot of people came together and agreed to abide by that protocol and therefore could communicate with each other, but there was no real, it wasn't a telecommunications company that controlled all the endpoints. It was just a definition of how to interact with each other. We're starting to see conversations about this in the social media space. So Jack Dorsey at Twitter put out a tweet storm talking about something he calls blue sky, which is thinking about what it would mean if we mediated these conversations with a protocol instead of a platform. And I think if we pull that apart, we're going to find that you can actually manage that market much more easily than a concentrated market. So you need less regulation. The market itself will actually, in some ways, self-correct. And so you need less regulation. The regulation that you need is more about solving the particular market problem associated with the exclusive control of data than it is about trying to achieve an outcome. So I think, I'm hopeful that the governments around the world are recognizing that their initial foray into this space was somewhat naive, prescriptive, and that the next one will be more informed and more suited to the nature of this particular technology.
Absolutely. I know that you're spending a lot of your time these days working with decentralized networks mediated by a cryptocurrency and secured on an open public blockchain. Tell me a little bit about what it is about this structure that appeals to you and why you believe these are good investments.
So, when I first started investing in the internet, it was in the mid-90s, and it felt like there was this incredible energy around this new network and the possibilities of this new network, and it felt as if we were going to democratize access to knowledge and power, and all of us kind of went into it with an enormous amount of enthusiasm. And we've seen, fundamental changes. I mean, we've seen fundamental changes in the media industry as we moved from an industry that was essentially controlled by distribution. You had a radio station and a television station and a cable channel, and they controlled everything that we consumed on those sites. And then we all agreed to talk to each other on this open platform, and that distribution bottleneck went away, and we had this explosion of innovation that left us with the world we have today. What we didn't see is the reconsolidation around the control of data. And the reason I'm so excited about cryptocurrencies, cryptography generally, and decentralized systems is that it decentralizes the control over the data asset. In a protocol-based world, which is what all of these things are, users bring their own data to the party. In a platform world, users interact with the platform, and the platform controls the data. So I think that there are things that we could do. We've talked about them from a regulatory perspective that would be more generative and less prescriptive. But there's also technology that's inevitably kind of changing, almost the way grass grows up through the pavement. It's changing the way we think about data ownership, and crypto is at the very forefront of that.
That's excellent. Final question for you is on something that's touched on in our Trends of Entrepreneurship report. We have seen that there's tremendous concentration, as you well know, of venture capital funding in the places you'd expect, like Silicon Valley and New York City. How would you say smaller regions can compete, and what does it take for you as an investor to invest in a company outside of the typical VC hubs?
So I'll answer the second question first, which is not much. I mean, I personally invested in Philadelphia, in Pittsburgh, in Berlin. Our firm has invested as far south as Buenos Aires and as far east as maybe not much further east than Berlin. But we'll go to where the entrepreneurs are and where the innovation is. And we do think that is less concentrated than it once was. there are challenges when you, so for instance, recruiting to a startup in Pittsburgh, if you recruit to a startup in Silicon Valley and the startup fails, the people that come to work there can immediately take those skills and apply them at 20 other startups right down the street. There's less density in some of these other areas, so it's harder to immediately turn around and apply those skills. And so it's a little bit, but it's what we're seeing is the gradual decentralization of these locuses of innovation, and I think that's a very good thing. I think that a lot of the internet-enabled social media networks are inherently sort of global, and so geography isn't quite as big a deal. I work with some companies where, like DuckDuckGo, which is I say Philadelphia-based company, but they have 70 employees and there's only 6 of them in Philadelphia and the rest are scattered around the world. But they're now able to run an organization of 70 people with technology infrastructure that is way beyond what we've ever seen before. So I participated in their Friday afternoon stand-up meetings, all team meetings, and it's 70 little images on a box, and everybody is sort of on the same level, interacting in the same way, and they've learned how to make that work. And so I think there is, number one, less and less of a advantage to being in one of these hubs. There are still some, and there will be some. There's more capital in these hubs. There's more experienced entrepreneurs that can be mentors in these hubs. But with more global communication, venture capital that's willing to travel, and I think there's more and more of that. I think it's starting to balance out.
Fantastic. Brad, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your insights.
You're very welcome.
Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to be here and talk a bit more about the Trends in Entrepreneurship report released this morning. As highlighted in the report, your work has explored some of the difficulties for founders not knowing what they don't know. Do you have any insights into which areas this lack of knowledge usually hurts them the most?
Well, it's good to be with you. Thanks for the question. Founders really don't know what they don't know. And that's especially problematic when they're coming in trying to start up their business because they don't quite understand what that pain point is. So it's especially relevant as it relates to problem uncertainty. And problem uncertainty is like, are we focusing on the right thing? There's a whole host of things we could be focusing on, but have we really gotten clear on the pain point? So yes, the unknown unknowns is problematic for lots of things, but especially on that fuzzy front end as it relates to the pain point.
Absolutely. How can entrepreneurs compensate for not knowing what they don't know?
Well, this is what accelerators are often trying to do, is they're trying to combat some of these biases and blind spots of entrepreneurs. And one of the interesting things they do to combat the unknown unknowns is they expose entrepreneurs to up to 70 or 80 unique mentors, sometimes in the first 3 weeks. I mean, Starr is one of the most common and well-known accelerators, has a thing that they call mentor whiplash. And you're meeting so many of these mentors that your head is literally spinning. Some are saying go left, some are saying go right, some are saying go up, some are saying go down. You're literally paralyzed, you don't know what to do. But what happens is over the course of 20, 30, 40 of these meetings, you start to see the thread and the feedback, and you're like, oh, that's it. That's the value proposition. I thought I knew what it was coming in, but I was totally off, and I was off in a big way. So what they do is they expose the entrepreneurs to these mentors to force search open. That's the problem that founders have, is they actually prematurely close search. They lock in to first solutions. And so these organizations like accelerators combat that by forcing search open. The mentors is a forcing mechanism to keep it open. So that's one thing, is just being exposed to lots of mentors, and importantly, in a condensed or collapsed fashion. Because this is an example of when drinking from a fire hose is actually a good thing. It actually prevents you from optimizing a suboptimal plan. So that's maybe one. The other thing is, I think a lot of times with founders, they'll go to visits together. They want to show solidarity. They want to show unity. And so they're there together to pitch. The problem with that is it assumes that you as my co-founder, got what I got out of that pitch. And so we never really talk about it. So one of the other things you can do to combat sort of cognitive biases is you want to divide and conquer, which sounds obvious. But not only does it allow you to cover more ground, but when you come together, now I'm forced to discuss with you what the key points were, what were the highlights, what were the takeaways. So I have to think about those causal relationships in my mind as you're peppering me with questions. So I think that's number two, is divide and conquer. And then the last one is maybe have someone that's a little bit more objective put the founding team together. We often use this analogy or metaphor of marriage. You want to be connected to people on many different levels, but because we have biases and blind spots, we don't recognize some problems that could come up in the future. So I think our research is suggesting that a perhaps better metaphor is an arranged marriage. It's sort of an unbiased third party that can say, you know what, you two would be really good. I know kind of your strengths and weaknesses. I know your strengths and weaknesses, and I think you can offset each other and complement each other. So those are sort of three things, is the condensed, collapsed, compressed mentorship, divide and conquer, and maybe having an arranged marriage.
That's great. On the topic of arranged marriages, my next question is, how do solo founders compare to co-founders?
Well, there's obviously a lot more solos out there. I think some of the research would suggest there's up to 4 times as many solo-founded companies. But what the literature would suggest is the deck is kind of stacked against you if you're going to go it alone. You've got liabilities of newness as a founder. You've got no track record, no credibility, no legitimacy. And so you've got to overcome these liabilities. And that's just harder when you're by yourself. So these co-founders can help you overcome these liabilities. They can share in the pain. They can give you empathy. So there's a lot of benefits. And I think the literature's kind of gone down that path, suggesting that co-founders would be a much better alternative than solos. In fact, a lot of these incubators, accelerators, co-working spaces don't even want you if you're solo. It's almost a requirement when you're applying to list out those co-founders. So that was our question, is, under what conditions could a solo outperform or perform as well as, co's? And I think what the literature doesn't talk about is these liabilities of conflict. It talks about liabilities of newness, the things that you need to overcome as a founder. But when you're co-founding with someone, you just have inherent conflicts. Roles, responsibilities, equities. Often you haven't spent a whole lot of time together, so these conflicts can actually destroy a founding team pretty quickly. And so the benefit of going it alone is you avoid some of these liabilities of conflict. But what we also found is these solos are not really solo. They'll bring others in to help them, what we're calling co-creators. And this is work that Travis Howell, a doctoral student, has done. They bring in these co-creators, whether they're employees or benefactors or alliances, that kind of take on a pseudo co-founder role but don't have that sort of equity assigned to them. And so they can actually provide sort of they almost act as a proxy as a co-founder. So these co-creators, I think, is a very interesting concept to explore going forward, how solos are really not solo.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. What else have you found interesting about research on founders?
One of the things that I found interesting is that they're still around by the time they go IPO. A lot of them are still around. You would think, a lot of times these founders are really great for that early stage. They've got the vision, they've got the passion, but they don't really have the skill set to take their organization to the next level. So by the time a lot of organizations IPO, the founder's gone. They're going to bring in a more professional management team that's got experience scaling and growing. But what we found is that actually a lot of founders stay around. And so our question was, is that good? Is that bad? And what we found is that, yes, they do surround themselves with a team that ostensibly looks pretty diverse, pretty broad, pretty rich in experience, but they're not giving them much attention. And it's because the founder kind of retains control. So on the outside, I don't want to say this sort of a facade, it looks like a really powerful team, but they're retaining a lot of control. And so they're bringing in a great team, but they're not tapping into the benefits of the team, and then that creates problem for performance. So usually the ones that stay on, they actually kind of suffer. So that's one, is what do the teams look like that surround the founders in those later stages? And again, the punchline is that they look pretty good, but the founder's not tapping into that great team. Two, the other interesting thing as it relates to founders is this idea that we're calling boomerang founders. A lot of times they leave, but then they come back again. I mean, Steve Jobs is sort of the classic example of this, but we see it a lot with other organizations. So our question was, is this a good thing? Are boomerang CEOs good? And what we found is no, they're not. They're usually not. And boomerang CEO founders are even worse when they come back. And the logic is your mental model when you started this is very different than the mental model you need to have in the here and now. The landscape has changed, competition has changed, and yet often you bring in that mental anchor and you're kind of running it as you did in the early stages. So these boomerang founders, not so great, not so great.
That's a good insight. And changing gears slightly to a few of the other focus areas in the Trends Report, ecosystems. What's important to stimulate, sustain, and support new markets?
Market creation or formation is really tough. And the reason why is it usually requires more effort and resources than a single firm can provide. It requires what we would call collective action. Okay, so I can't do it alone. But collective action is really, really hard because I might not know you, I might not trust you, I might have a different vision for how this industry is going to evolve and grow. So collective action is imperative, but it's really hard to get. In particular, when you're trying to create this market or this ecosystem, there's a number of different uncertainties that you're trying to address. The literature disproportionately goes to what we would call demand uncertainty. Let's bring together people so that we can make sure that individuals or users really want what we have. So we bring together suppliers and providers to help address demand uncertainty. But one of the other really important things that you need to think about when you're building up an ecosystem or you're building up a market is not only demand uncertainty, do people want this, but supply uncertainty. Can we even provide this, right? And so when you're building up an ecosystem, when you're building up a market, you want to bring together constituents that can help you address both demand uncertainty and supply uncertainty. The challenge, of course, is there's a lot of hype around ecosystems, but when you bring in all these people together and you've got this common vision of how we're going to work together to legitimize and establish this market, it's a high structure strategy. You've got a lot of moving pieces. And what people don't realize is that often the success of an ecosystem is contingent on future market growth. Because when you've got lots of parts and lots of interconnected parts, if the market slows down, the economy slows down, your tendency is to make a piecemeal change, but because everything is connected to everything else, your ecosystem often has to, be broken down completely and rebuild back up, which takes time and money.
That makes sense. Recently, there's been significant growth and fluctuation in VC funding. Do you think that that trend will stay persistent, or are there alternative forms of funding that we should be on the lookout for?
I've been really curious about these accelerators. Really, they were unheard of almost 10 years ago, but we see almost 8,000 plus accelerators on the scene now. Over a third of new ventures went through accelerators. A third of ventures receiving Series A financing went through accelerators. They're becoming increasingly important. Now, two distinguishing characteristics of accelerators that set them apart from incubators. One is they're almost time-bound, almost always time-bound. Like 3 months is very common. Whereas an incubator, you could be in there a year, 2 years, 2.5 years is kind of usually the average time. So accelerators are time-bound. Accelerators are also cohort-based. So we start and end as a cohort. By contrast, in an incubator, you could go in and there might be other companies around you, but you're not starting and ending as a cohort. Now, the reason why I think this is interesting for entrepreneurial finance is that the venture capital model is primarily a sequential investment model. I decide to invest in you, and then I move on to the next person. Do I decide to invest in them? But it's sequential, one after another. Whereas an accelerator is a simultaneous investment model. I'm simultaneously investing in 20, 30, 40, 80, 100 ventures at the same time. So a lot of people see it as sort of a disruption. So I think it's going to be a very interesting format to watch.
That's helpful feedback. I like that. Finally, putting your academic hat back on, we know that entrepreneurship is a very vast and deep field. What is the next frontier, and what can academic researchers explore to help move the needle for practitioners?
I hear many companies coming with a question that is somehow phrased around help us become entrepreneurial leaders. These are large, established, bureaucratic organizations that have been around a long time. So entrepreneurship is no longer just a nice thing, it is absolutely critical, and it's critical for all organizations. Almost even more important for large bureaucratic organizations that are trying to avoid stagnation and continue to grow and scale and move on to the next big thing. So I think the big question is, what does it look like to lead in entrepreneurial settings? We have this obsession with this idea of pivoting. I think people talk about the pivot out the wazoo, and it kind of drives me crazy because I want to remind them, look, there's another leg there when you're pivoting, and that comes from basketball, and that leg is actually planted. And so the insight is the plant allows the pivot, the stability allows the change. So highly adaptive, highly entrepreneurial individuals have something stable that allows them to change. At the individual level, it could be your family, your faith, your friends, but at the organizational level, what is that plant leg and what is the pivot leg? And more broadly, I think what it means to lead in entrepreneurial settings is, and by entrepreneurial settings, I don't just mean sort of startup, nascent industries, but also large bureaucratic organizations that are trying to grow and scale. I think it's managing fundamental tensions. So one fundamental tension is efficiency and flexibility. We've got to make money in the here and now, but if we just focus on efficiency, we have no tomorrow. But if I just focus on flexibility and exploration, I'm not going to make payroll next week. So how do I do that? How do I balance those two? They're both really important. Another one is simple or complex. As you continue to grow and move into more markets, have more customers, more services and products, complexity just naturally follows a successful organization. But how do you pare back? How do you really focus on the things that matter most? What about deliver and discover? Over time, organizations add more and more structure that kind of pushes us towards delivery at the expense of discovery. So again, there's these fundamental tensions that I think leaders have to manage, and they have to manage very carefully. And that is really, for me, the essence of leading in entrepreneurial settings. But I think that is a very big and very important question going forward.
Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights. I know that folks who are interested in learning more about your research can access and download the full Trends in Entrepreneurship report from frontiers.unc.edu. And thank you again.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Arlan Hamilton, it's such a pleasure to have you here today, and thank you so much for joining me. I know you just delivered our luncheon keynote at the Frontiers of Entrepreneurship Conference. Really appreciate your participation also in our inaugural Trends in Entrepreneurship report.
Yes.
I know we're going to be talking a bit about that today, but I want to start from the beginning. You taught yourself how to start your own venture capital firm and raise money for a fund. Tell me a bit about that journey, as well as any recommendations you might have for someone interested in forging a similar path.
Sure. Well, hopefully before you start a fund, you have some sort of basis for yourself. Like, you know that there's a good reason to do it, or you have someone who already wants to anchor you or back you a little bit, and then you can build on that. I wouldn't recommend starting it completely from scratch the way that I did, only because it has been a difficult process, and if I had other resources, I would have tapped into them. But I didn't, so I started the fund a few years ago, officially in September 2015, but started working on it, the idea, the thesis, 3 years or so before that. And it really was just talking to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people and putting myself out there and having a very, very clear idea of what I wanted to do and what the ask was, and learning over time and getting better at asking and better at honing in on what people were relating to. And so the fund itself is for, it's a tech fund, so I'm investing in mostly tech companies, startups, and those startups are founded by underrepresented founders who are women, people of color, LGBTQ, from all over the country and all over different industries and stages now at this point.
Excellent. I know we're gonna talk a little bit more about that focus of the firm
Sure.
in a bit. But first question for you is when Backstage Capital is making an investment, what are you looking for in a company? Is it the business idea, or is it the people behind it that really drive your decision?
Well, it's both. It's always both, and I think that's the case for many investors. So Backstage isn't that different from a lot of investors in that way, where we are looking for really great companies. We're looking for a large opportunity. We're looking for things that can have impact, kind of change the dynamics of industries, things like that. And we also have several people on the team who can make decisions about investing. So it's not just what I'm looking for, but it's what different people are looking for. Where we start to stand out is what we consider to be signs of potential. And it starts to look a little different than the average venture capitalist. And for instance, I personally look at a working mother, for instance, is to me an asset. To me is someone who's a multitasker, someone who gets things done, someone who can be creative and resourceful, rather than what normally happens. And this isn't across the board, but a lot of times this has actually happened where they are either implicitly or explicitly questioned about their ability to do both, to be a working mom. And for us, it's an asset. And so that's just one example of many, but we're trying to we invest in the best entrepreneurs that we find, and we look in places other people aren't looking.
Fantastic. I know you mentioned this earlier, but your portfolio includes a lot of emerging technology, including fintech, govtech, Internet of Things.
Mm-hmm.
What area in the emerging tech space are you most excited about, and what trends should we be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so trends, I tend not to look at trends. If you ask me right now what the hot thing is out there, I honestly don't. That's one of the very few things I don't study. I study every day a lot of things, but it's more about putting together my own thesis and finding, it's like art to me. You know, a lot of times people will try to think through art a little bit more than they should, and I follow an instinct that's a little bit different. But I personally just love the fact that so many people are now looking at the older generation, or older generations, and for so long I felt that they have been discarded. And there are a lot of things that we can tap into that are viable businesses that are talking about or addressing this older group of people who are in the millions, who have a lot of buying power and a lot of political power. And we sort of roll our eyes, some generations sort of roll their eyes at, oh, they're X number and over, so they don't know what's going on because they're not hip to tech. Well, I can tell you right now, my mother, who is 70, knows she has an iPhone, she has a Google thing, Alexa, this and this and that, and I don't have those things, and she knows how to make them work, and I have no idea. So I think we underestimate them, and there are so many people now there are more people now who are looking at that. And for instance, Monique Woodard, who is a colleague in the venture space and has been doing this for a long time, she just released a study about this in the last few days about the growing asset that is that generation.
I love that. My mom is around the same age, as also a huge Alexa fan. So
Yes.
so it's a huge part
And
of our day-to-day.
It's kind of made for that too, because you have some people who have lost their spouses, like my mother has, an older generation, and older people have, and they are, voice is really interesting. If you've ever been on the phone with your mom or your dad, they talk because they're used to being around you every moment of the day for decades, and now they are not, but they still want to interact. And I think it's just one more piece is so interesting. There's a lot that can happen in the audio space with 65 plus.
I could not agree more. We talk about that a lot with emerging technologies, and I think that's a great insight. A lot of this is about building connections, and I know that's something that your firm, Backstage Capital, is really focused on, especially with pulling in underrepresented founders into the entrepreneurial ecosystem. What role has this focus on underrepresented founders played in helping you to define your firm's competitive advantage and drive your success?
Well, it's been day one. It's been our thesis from day one that a group that is so heavily overlooked, and yes, underestimated, we say that a lot because it was sort of coined from us, it's just sort of inevitable that you're going to find something that's been untapped, something that is going to be unearthed there. So that's kind of, to me, a 101 thing. And then being able to live it, it was a thesis at first, and then being able to live it for so many years now, and we're just getting started, I can say with all certainty, and I'll give you a concrete way that this is the case. If I were handed $100 million today, which is 10 times the amount I've raised in the last 5 years, I would put it towards underrepresented founders if I were trying to double, triple, et cetera, that. Because I have seen the data, I have seen it in action, after seeing thousands of companies and seeing how the founders operate, what sort of odds they're beating, which gives me great insights into the potential they have if they have more resources. And so I would just be all in there. And that is after tapping into, like, asking myself internally. So I don't have to put on anything. I can just think about it. And I'm like, yeah, and it happened. Actually, Mark Cuban gave me $1 million last year to invest the way I see fit as an additional fund that he and I are partnering on, or did partner on. And the only mandate was that I couldn't put more than $100,000 in one deal. So it's anywhere from 10 to 20 deals. I did 12 deals. Every single one of them was an underrepresented founder, and I had carte blanche to do whatever I wanted. And it just happened naturally because I had spent the last however many years seeing what was there.
You put your money where your mouth is.
Yeah, and I feel, it's one thing to say it and to want it to be so, and it's one thing to hypothesize that it's so, because that's really what it was. It's what any fund is I think this will work, and I want to put it in action. And it's quite another thing to be in it for that amount of time, and even early in it, but still know that that's where you're going to put your chips each and every time.
It's a fantastic thing, and great that you're unleashing so much of that previously untapped potential.
Yes.
Statistics show us that founders receiving capital today remain a fairly homogenous group, overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male.
Yes.
Yet investors consistently say they're seeking more opportunities to back women, to back people of color, folks from the LGBTQ community, a lot of these underrepresented groups we've discussed. All of these groups in turn report having trouble accessing capital.
Yeah.
So where does this disconnect lie between these would-be founders and investors?
I think there are some investors who didn't before who are really trying to make an effort. I think of a first round capital is a good example of that. Atomico in the UK is a great example of that. I actually see them doing the work and either hiring for it to help them learn more, or just going out and taking that risk of maybe making some false starts, but just trying. I think that's so important. But I think if there's anyone who's like kind of reticent to do that, or just doesn't feel like they want to do it, but they don't know exactly if they can do it in an authentic way, you have, excuse me, you have these smaller funds, these boutique funds like Backstage Capital. You have them now in the dozens. They didn't exist at the scale they do today, just 5 years ago. So you do have them. You have them done by people who are living and breathing examples of the people they're trying to invest in. And they're, in most cases, except for maybe two that I can think of, are very resource strapped. So you have that. They're doing all of the work. They're doing the groundwork. They're establishing authenticity. They're relatable. They're the people that are sourcing for you. And then you have people who want to be part of that, have more resources, but don't exactly know where to start. I say the smartest, in my opinion, the cleverest, the most clever investors are going to be those who find one, look at a few, find one they gel with, and say, invite them to come under the umbrella. I don't know if they'll say yes. I don't even know if Backstage would say yes to that. But I think that the clever investors who have the means should be making those bets, sort of like you're recruiting for a sports, major sports team. You want to find the stars and bring them under your umbrella, so that they then, or think of it as an acqui-hire in some way if it's an entrepreneur. But you do that with the fund itself. So you take on their portfolio and you take on their partners, and now you have that in-house. And I think that's going to be, I predict you'll see a lot more of that.
That would be great. It's fantastic. In addition to access to capital, what would you say are some of the greatest challenges faced by underrepresented founders today? And have you seen any changes in these dynamics over your time in the venture capital space?
I think one of the biggest challenges, if in all honesty, is just being believed. Being believed. I mean, we can call it many things, being understood and being respected and listened to, but what it comes down to is that some people do not believe other people's strife or their perspective of how they have to walk in the world. Some people are just incredulous to the way other people are living, and willfully so. And so it's almost a traumatic experience for someone who has to go through that. You get enough paper cuts, it's gonna hurt like hell. And I think it's just, it's kind of, it's not easy to pinpoint, it's not easy to change and say, okay, that changed overnight. We know what that looks like, we can measure that. But it's something that, if you think about, you can be part of the solution. You can make a decision that if you're in a position of power, or a position of privilege, like we all are in some ways, to just take a beat the next time you talk to someone and believe them a little bit more, or consider the fact that they may be telling the truth about their own lives.
That's very important for all of us to remember. That's a great nugget. Backstage Capital, I know, has an accelerator program in Detroit, one in London, LA, and Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. What are your goals for these accelerator programs?
Yeah, so we started the accelerator, we announced it in the fall of 2018. We had the accelerator itself March through May and June of last year, 2019, and we got nearly 2,000 applications in about less than a 2-month period. And it was highly competitive. We came out of it with 24 companies across those 4 cities and 2 countries, and we built that from scratch again. With this bootstrapped, resource-strapped boutique fund that could. We did that, and we have a report out, at backstagecapital.com that talks about, it's a 20-page report or so, that talks about all of the things that happened in those 3 months that they were with us. And then, of course, we've stayed in touch with all of them afterwards, and to the degree that they want to be in touch with us. To me, that was quite the success. It was very difficult to pull off. We had a lot of financial woes in the middle of it. And so it was a huge success, though, and we were able to catalyze and accelerate these companies. So looking at 2020, what we know about 2020 is we don't have the resources to do a cohort this year, but what we can do, in kind of 2 birds, 1 stone situation, is we are going on a tour, and the tour is going to be a 10+ city tour where we go to different places, some of them already in the accelerator, some of them not, who have asked us to have an accelerator there. So we can engage even more with local ecosystems and local players to bring us to their city, so that with the hope that in 2021 we come back to the cities we were already in and we add on to that. And so that would be really cool. So I think we started with a great case study, which is what we kind of spent our time doing, is like, you say it can't be done, we'll show you the example of it, and hopefully we'll replicate that, and you all will too.
That's great. Well, and fantastic that so many folks are going to get to hear from you more about that.
Yeah, the tour, we're so excited about it, and it's going to kick off in New York, and we'll have some dates and cities announced in February.
Awesome. I know that in the first cohort report, a key learning was that there is no pipeline problem, rather there's an access problem. It's something that you know pretty inherently and see every day. What role do accelerators broadly play in addressing this issue of access? And do you think this can be replicable in communities across the U.S., or do they need a certain infrastructure?
I think accelerators are great. I mean, what Backstage has been even before the accelerator, and now we're able to see it even more, it's like we're basically that friends and family round, or that friends and family fund. That there's a gap there. And accelerators are like right after that in some cases. Not all accelerators are the same, so they're going to catch you in different places, especially if they've been around for years and they have higher and higher and higher thresholds to get in. But a really great local accelerator can be life-altering for these companies. And by the same token, a poorly run one can be very distracting and almost detrimental to a company. So I think it's like, I think absolutely a great accelerator can be built in any ecosystem that has founders, has the deal flow, has people who want to be mentors, people who want to pay it forward. Maybe they've had some success in their lives and they want to put money where their mouth is and time. And anything that has any sort of city or government help is really helpful too, no matter if it's for-profit or nonprofit. That's always going to be a plug, because you want to think about what happens next. Is it just these 3 months? You want to go forward. It is not for the faint of heart to build this from scratch, to build an accelerator. But I do think it can flourish. It's like I think about, you compare it to seeds, right? Flowers and plants. There are different types that can grow almost anywhere. Even in the toughest situations. It's just when you are going out to build one, really, really know that you're going to be an additive to those companies, and it's not an ego project. So that's why we waited so long to do an accelerator. We had to get to that point where we're like, is it just because we want to slap our name on something and say we have an accelerator and try to compete with Techstars and YC, or do we really believe we're going to bring something different? And until we thought that, and even while we had the accelerator, we'll look at a company, even in our portfolio, and say, you should go to this other accelerator if we think they'd get more out of it. I remember doing that even during the application process, and that's kind of crazy, but at the same time, you want what's best for your founders, because that comes back to you.
That's exactly right. And zooming out now to look at venture capital firms more broadly, one finding that was highlighted in our Trends in Entrepreneurship report is that there's a lack of representation in decision makers at these venture capital firms. Yes. From your experience, what impact, if any, does this have on the dispersion of VC dollars?
I think it has a lot. It's not one-to-one, right? It's not you put a woman in place, now you're going to have, and that she makes up 20% of the firm, now you're going to have 20% more women or total invested in. I don't think it's one for one, but I do think it is significant, and it's not to be undervalued or underestimated in itself, because it's almost just like human nature. You're going to be able to recognize patterns that are going to read differently to you if you've had some experience. You know, if you have walked in that person's shoes, and sometimes literally walked in that person's heels or something, you know what that feels like, rather than not knowing what it feels like. It gives you a little bit more of an edge that translates. And now we've had some very concrete evidence now from data after so many years that adding just one woman to a firm of any size has like they're outsized returns compared to the rest, and that's in venture and in hedge funds. So it's just a matter of diversifying in general. I'm going to say the same thing. If I see a venture fund that has 3 black men running it, I'm going to say, where's at least one woman? If I see a venture fund that has 3 Hispanic women, I'm going to say, where's your diversity there? And I'm going to challenge myself, and I'm going to challenge others. It's not just all white is bad equals bad, and you're doing it wrong. It's, can we all challenge each other to look at what we're doing, and I'll hold myself to the same standard.
Absolutely, and I know that the research certainly backs that up, that it's diversity at every level and across genders, across sexual orientation, across race and ethnicity.
Yeah, it's work. That's the thing. I know it's work. It's not that it just comes easy to me because I'm black and gay and a woman. It doesn't, it's work to do it, and that's why not everybody does it. It's like if you ever see A League of Their Own, Tom Hanks says to Gina Davis, she said, it got too hard. He said, of course it's hard. If it wasn't hard, everybody would do it. So if you want to be excellent, you have to walk through that difficulty. You have to go the extra mile. It is not going to be easy. That's the point.
You have to strap on those cleats.
That's right. That's right.
The Rockford Peaches.
Yes. Now I got to go watch it.
It's so good. I know, right? I know what I'm doing tonight.
Yeah, it's great.
Well, Arlan, my last question for you is, what changes do you think VC firms need to make to not only diversify their workforce, but also to capitalize on the untapped potential of underrepresented founders?
I think it can start with trying to look at it in hiring. I mean, hiring is but either way actually works if you go towards it. Like, you can't keep talking about it. You can't keep showing up in Forbes think pieces and in sponsorship of things, and then back at home, your homepage is, looks like The Sound of Music. You can't, the Family Von Trapp. You can't do that because you now know better. So now you need to do better. And it can be incremental. And it also, of course, depends on your own resources. You might be a pretty cash-strapped fund yourself when it comes to management fees, so you may not be able to hire anybody. You may have two guys running it, and it's a $40 million fund, and you're in the Midwest, and you can't hire anybody right now because you can barely pay yourselves until there's carry that comes in. But maybe you can take, pay the ticket price to go to an Afrotech, pay the ticket price to fly out and meet with Backstage, pay the ticket price to be in these rooms that no one has shut you out of. Everyone is inviting you to. There's no longer an excuse. It doesn't. You can be as thrifty and as hacky. You can be a hacker, just like you're telling your founders to do.
It's fantastic advice. Arlan, thank you so much for your time
Thank
and for
you.
sharing your insights. We're so thrilled to have you.
Appreciate it.
And for our folks watching at home, please remember that you can download the full Trends in Entrepreneurship report at frontiers.unc.edu. If you have a trend that you would like to see highlighted in future iterations of the report, you can email us at frontiers@unc.edu. Thanks for tuning in.